Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Chair, Center for American Progress, John Podesta.
Thank you. Morning, everybody, and thanks for getting up so early. And probably at least a few of you, like me, had a late night. So I appreciate the fact that you're here. This is a very important conversation. I'm going to give a couple of introductory remarks, and we're going to begin it with some presentations. But really, we want this to be an open conversation. We want your ideas, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. I want to thank, first of all, the CGI staff and the Fuel Freedom Foundation for organizing this breakfast session. I think if you ask most people about what the very poor and developing countries need, the answers would range from education to medicine to making childbirth safe. Probably it wouldn't be top of the mind to say fuel and fuel costs. But that really, I think, misunderstands the challenge of the poor around the world. They don't understand that many rural women and girls spend hours every day collecting fuel just to burn in indoor cook stoves, and that spews out smoke and soot that's killing 1.5 million people a year prematurely, polluting the air, getting into their families' lungs. They don't understand that in urban areas in some developing countries, paying for kerosene for lamps and stoves can eat up nearly half of the family's budget. Not only is it a dirty solution, but high costs make it really harder for urban poor to get ahead no matter how hard they work. They don't understand that the same fluctuation in oil prices that make some of us here in the United States groan when they fill up their gas tank can make food dramatically more expensive in the marketplaces of the developing world as transportation costs skyrocket, as input costs skyrocket. High oil prices lead to hunger, not just irritation, in the great bulk of the world. Lack of access to reliable energy and high fuel prices are a major driver of poverty in the developing world, which is one of the reasons that the UN high-level panel on the post-2015 development agenda, which I had the great privilege of serving on last year, included a goal of securing energy in a report to the Secretary General last spring. One of the things that was really, I think, quite different from the MDGs to the new report, and I think for those of you who are following this post-2015 debate, in the Secretary General's report that he's making to the UN General Assembly this week, is the need to connect the extreme poor to the modern economy, to find ways of ensuring that they have access to energy, to finance, to telecommunications, to information. But I think at the heart of that was the need to find ways to both double renewable energy in the global energy mix, but most importantly to ensure access to modern energy services in order to have the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030. The Secretary General's SE for All initiative, President Obama's Power Africa initiative, which he announced this spring, are much in the same vein. Conventional transportable energy, I learned a new term this morning, transportable energy, energy fuels, oil and gas have a near monopoly on much of the world's economy, but in my view, there are ways we can change the picture for the better, and that's what we're here to discuss. To set the stage, we have three wonderful speakers. You have their bios. I'm going to give them the briefest of introductions, and then I'm going to ask a panel a few questions, but as I said, I hope that we can have an interactive session. We don't have a whole lot of time this morning before the opening session, but I want to get you all into the conversation. To start, we're going to hear from Yossi Hollander, the chairman and co-founder of the Fuel Freedom Foundation, who's a co-sponsor of this breakfast, who's going to talk a bit about how fuel policy and alternative fuel markets can move people out of poverty. So, Yossi.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here today, early in the morning. We wish to thank President Clinton for his leadership and the CGI staff for their help. John, thank you for moderating, and thank you, CGI members, for coming. We're looking forward to interact with you. First, a few words about the Fuel Freedom Foundation. We're an American nonprofit, and our goal is to reduce the cost of fuel at the pump by at least $1 a gallon within this decade. We want you to be able to fill your current car with alternative fuels that exist today in the US. And as a result, to free a lot of free income and ignite economic growth. I would like to introduce my co-founder, Eyal Aronoff. When you exit here, you'll have packets with more information about us. I encourage you to go to our website, fuelfreedom.org, to learn more. But today, it's not about America. It's about the poorest 3 billion of the world and their access to a very precious resource we call fuel. So people have been connecting the issue of energy or energy consumption with level of developments for many, many years. It's quite known that they're all connected. I mean, you can see it very well that sub-Saharan Africa uses 2% of the world's energy for 15% of the world population. And so I think that's what we call energy poverty. And of course, that accompanies other types of poverty. There is really nothing new about that. This is like a very known thing. I think the problem we have is looking at it in that way only. And that's where I think we want to introduce a little bit of a new subject. We want to talk about fuels, not about energy. Most of the discussion about energy right now in the panels and everywhere is always about distributed electricity, solar, etc. This is not because this is what their problem is in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. This is the problem we think that we want to see our society developing into. But is this the real problems in Africa? No, I think the real problems in Africa are actually about fuels, and I suggest that we change the discussion to fuels. Whether they be transportation fuels, fertilizer is a fuel, it's made from natural gas, it is a fuel, it's an energy. Cooking fuels, we'll hear about it. Electric power is just one fuel. Lighting, not necessarily electric in Africa, is a fuel. Heating, irrigation is a fuel. All of them are involved fuel, and I suggest we start discussing fuels and not energy. Also, we need to stop being religiously tied to just one type of fuels. Every country and region has different fuels. We need to look at fossil fuels. Africa has more and more oil, but yet it imports almost all its gasoline. It doesn't use its natural gas. It has huge natural gas resources. They're flared. Why? Because they cannot compete in the world market with oil. The oil has been exported. Nobody really start developing the resources they have internally. And that's one of the things we need to look. We also need to look at biofuels in Africa. It's got the greatest available land potential in the world, most of it with water. There's plenty of crop residues around Africa. We have to start thinking, not in the way we think about it, but really in a local biofuel way, because that's probably going to provide us a lot of solutions. I think local is the key word. There's no such a thing as a solution for Africa or a solution for Southeast Asia or even for India. There is a solution for a region or country. There'll be different fuels available in different places, different fuel sources, different solutions. So maybe Nigeria has a lot of oil but very little fertilizer, but they flare their natural gas. They're number one in the world, I think, in flaring right now. We're number 4. We need to think about local also in terms of creation of fuel. Our model, which is based on good piping and good transportation, will not work. We need to think about distributed liquid fuel and fertilizer production as close as possible to the source. I'm not suggesting this is the only solution, but I think we need to start thinking about that the mega plants, efficient plant that we develop may not be the right solution, okay, in most of the world. And we need to start thinking about distributed production closer to the point of use. I think nothing is more acute than the problem of agricultural productivity. Just to give you an example, a ton of urea in Europe costs $90. When it gets to Mombasa, Kenya, it's $120. At Western Kenya, it's already $400. By the time it gets to Malawi, it's $770 a ton. This is, in a nutshell, the story of hunger and yields in Africa. And it's all transportation-based. We need to start thinking about how do we create those fuels, those fertilizers locally. Fertilizer is just one type of fuel, but transportation fuels are highly tied to agriculture development. And we need to look at that very, very carefully. We need to transport food to and from market. We need to transport seeds, pesticides, everything. We need to think about the cost of food and everything that goes to transportation, to agriculture, is tied very heavily into transportation, probably more than anything else. So what we suggest is to open our mind to some new concept, start discussing them, and we'll hope to continue discussing them during our talk today.
Terrific. Professor David Lee from the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University has spent a career thinking about agricultural productivity, so that's a great segue, I think, to you, David, please.
Thank you very much. And like Yossi, I'd like to thank everyone for coming this morning. I'd like to follow up on a couple of the challenges that Yossi Hollander identified, specifically with respect to some ongoing research we have at Cornell and specifically with respect to sub-Saharan Africa. One aspect of fuel insecurity or energy poverty that is often not fully appreciated is that fuel insecurity and food insecurity are closely related. This became evident in the 2007-2008 so-called food price crisis, to which higher oil prices and oil price shocks were a major contributing factor. Just a few highlights from a recent Cornell study that was funded by the Gates Foundation in East Africa. Oil price shocks have a big impact on higher food costs that is sometimes under-recognized, underappreciated. And that's for many reasons. Yossi mentioned the higher cost of fertilizer, fuel used in irrigation, in processing, in many different mechanization, of course. But particularly we're finding in terms of our research, it's the effect of transportation and distribution. Distribution not only of inputs like fertilizer, but distribution of food itself. Oil price shocks transmit rapidly to rural markets and to rural people. In fact, often more rapidly, very often more rapidly than food prices, about which we hear so much. Poor households employ many different coping mechanisms in terms of changing their purchasing behavior, changing their consumption behavior, but they remain highly vulnerable to oil price shocks. And in the case of fuel, they don't have the buffering mechanism they do in the case of food, where they can often produce it locally. It's hard to produce a gallon of gasoline locally, but you can produce some of your food. So for all those reasons, measures to address fuel insecurity will also have an additional payoff in terms of food insecurity, whether that's infrastructure investments in making markets more efficient, investments in technology or policy changes. I'd like to briefly highlight a research program at Cornell that addresses the challenge of fuel diversification as well, that Yossi Hollander identified. For most households, fuel security means improving fuel access and fuel alternatives. Fuel diversification alternatives should be clean, ideally, should be clean, physically accessible, affordable, of course, and distributed. Distributed is important in terms of surmounting some of the infrastructure problems that are so endemic in places like sub-Saharan Africa. There are many options, of which biofuels are one. At Cornell, with support from Yossi Hollander, the National Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and other institutions, we're working on a small-scale pyrolysis-based system. This involves the charring of biomass or organic material to obtain synthesis gases, which are in turn converted to biofuels such as ethanol and methanol, as well as the production of solids, namely biochar, to which I'll return in a minute. This has been in the laboratory phase until recently. We've constructed a pilot-scale syngas platform for research purposes at Cornell and plan to subsequently construct a prototype plant in the field. This biofuel system has a number of advantages. Slow and low temperature pyrolysis can utilize a broad variety of feedstocks, including crop residues such as maize stover that is so plentiful in places like East Africa, sugarcane bagasse, and other organic substances. It's versatile in terms of the types of biofuels that can be produced, types of bioenergy that can be produced, butanol, ethanol, methanol, bio-oils, and others. It has the potential for small-scale, spatially distributed production units, which would help address some of the rural infrastructure problems that are ubiquitous in sub-Saharan Africa. And it has the capacity for drop-in transportation fuel, such as ethanol, and biochar for soil improvement that helps ensure the sustainability of the production base. Lastly, a word about biochar, since this helps address the joint fuel-food challenge identified earlier. Biochar is created by charring or carbonizing organic matter through pyrolysis from feedstocks that can include organic material from crop production, animal production, bioenergy crops, food processing waste, and so forth. There are many benefits of biochar. Improving crop yields by research has shown from 5 to 40%. It's carbon negative. It sequesters soil carbon in stable carbon pools, reduces methane and nitrous oxide emissions. It improves water quality through retaining soil nutrients and reducing leaching, and it increases soil fertility through reducing nutrient leaching and reducing soil acidity. So this is a very versatile and promising system and represents one of the potential solutions to the challenges identified earlier in this session. I have some contact information, and there'll be information in your packets when you leave for follow-up if you'd like to follow up with any of us at Cornell. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Radha Mathia is the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. Radha, I mentioned in my opening comments the health impacts of the fuel choices that are being made today and the impacts on the livelihoods of people who have to gather fuel to burn in often dirty conditions. So tell us a little bit about your initiative, where it stands now, and what the goal is going forward.
Sure. Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for being here this morning. So John has mentioned some of the impacts, health-related impacts from cooking over open fires. Let me put that in a broader context as well. Today, there are 3 billion people, that's 500 million households, who are dependent on food that's cooked over open fires. And when you cook over open fires, you do have a harmful smoke, and in some cases a toxic smoke, that's emitted from those fires that not only impacts health, and in fact, it's now the 4th highest health risk in the world, with latest figures suggesting 4 million deaths annually as a result of exposure to that smoke. So there's a huge health implication from that. We've also got recent data that show that 70% of all admissions to burns units and burns hospitals around the world are a result of cooking-related accidents, and these are in the developing world. We've also known that with cooking over open fires, you have 25% of the world's black carbon emissions that also come from the smoke and the emissions over open fires. So it's a considerable health issue, environmental issue, and clearly it's one that impacts women, as I'll explain in a moment here. If you're in a rural setting, whether you're in Kenya or Ghana or India or China, women can spend up to 8 hours a day in the process of collecting their fuel and cooking. So in most rural settings, people consider their fuel, quote unquote, free. You go out there, you gather it, and then you use it as your fuel. And in many instances, the reason it can take 5 hours at times to collect the fuel is that women don't want to have to go out every day to collect that fuel. They often go early in the morning, so it puts themselves at great personal risk, actually, when you go out at 4 or 5 in the morning, especially in certain refugee circumstances where you could put yourself at risk of attack. You come back, and then you can see the picture on the left here. You're cooking often in a small, confined space, and the smoke just fills up the entire area, often very poorly ventilated. You see in this picture, she's got a baby on her back. So again, another recipient, if you will, of secondhand smoke. So it's quite pervasive and a significant issue for women and their families. This is not just a factor in rural communities. In urban settings or peri-urban settings, you may not collect your fuel for free. You buy your fuel, whether it's charcoal or kerosene or even, packages of wood, if you will. And most of them do not buy, fuel as we would, in bulk, and have it consistently available. They buy it on the spot market daily often, and that's because of cash constraints and cash flow constraints. So this is a particular example here we have from Kenya, where the cost of buying charcoal for cooking is 40% of that family's household income. 40. So that's a substantial percentage. If there were more ready and accessible fuels available, more inexpensive fuels locally available, and cleaner and more efficient stoves, you can easily see 30 to 50% reduction in the amount of fuel that would have to be purchased. Now, the Global Alliance was launched right here at CGI 3 years ago. Secretary Clinton sort of led the cause and said, this is a problem that is solvable. This is something that we do have multiples and diverse solutions for, and we've got the technology, the know-how, the financing, and the ability to really address this issue. It should be eradicated. And so the Global Alliance has a vision by 2030, in line with Sustainable Energy for All that was mentioned earlier, to have universal adoption for clean cooking solutions, stoves and fuels. And our milestone, our intermediate target, is 100 million households adopting them by the year 2020. Now, how are we going to do that? What's unique about our approach is that we're taking very much a market-oriented approach to this. It isn't traditional aid that's going to make this happen. That hasn't worked in the past. We're not suggesting repeating that in the future. From a fuels perspective, it's very important to look at what you see here as a fuels ladder. Depending on what people have access to, being able to ensure that they have and be a part of more inclusive value chains, in their communities, so that they can be a part of that fuel production process. It enhances livelihoods, and that they can also use cleaner, more affordable, more efficient fuel. So there are multiple things that we're doing in terms of optimizing production, having more inclusive value chains, and ensuring that things like ethanol supply chains, et cetera, people are more aware of these as possibilities, and we understand where those barriers and inefficiencies are, so that we have more of a steady flow and availability of these fuels. So I mentioned an inclusive value chain, and I'll end with this, where it's very important to ensure that local communities are involved in, if it's cook stoves, right from the design, to the manufacturing, the distribution, and that will aid eventual adoption. If it's fuels, for them to be involved, especially in some of the processing and the conversion and the distribution. It's not just a livelihood aspect for them, but it also ensures accurate and sustained adoption of these fuels. So our vision is really a world where we see a picture more like this, of a woman happily cooking, locally available fuels, affordable. You don't see much smoke in that picture at all. And she's got the time to be able to do what she'd like to with her family, with her children. So that's our vision, and happy to talk a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and we're going to open it up to the audience. But Radha, I just want you to underscore one thing. You said that 25% of black carbon comes from cooking, open fire cooking. Talk a little bit about the climate change implications of that for people here who are sensitive to that question.
Sure. No, so what we have seen is this figure now of 25%, and it's not hard to imagine. I mean, you can see the smoke, you can see the impact that it would have, not just in your communities, but also as it results in soot as well. Now, there's several things that we're doing here, and the other thing that you can see is from a climate perspective, you saw the picture earlier of the woman carrying wood on her back, so increasingly that woman is having to walk further and further because of deforestation. And when you have significant deforestation, that impacts her from a fuel collection perspective and the amount of time she takes, but it also impacts the yield, the agricultural yield that can come from that community and from those farms. The soil is no longer as productive as it could be. You start, when it does rain, you start to see floods and erosion, so there's a whole cycle and a whole sense of, sort of linkages, a domino effect, if you will, that can occur from the simple act of not having, sort of proper sources of clean fuel available.
Okay. David, Radha mentioned the inclusive supply chain, and you're in a university, and I often think there's sort of a problem of making that connection between university-based research and building that inclusive supply chain. So are you tackling that, and what's your approach to ensuring that technologies that you're developing in a lab at Cornell end up having application in communities that really need?
Very good question, John. The the second effort that I mentioned, the pyrolysis project, has been ongoing for over 3 years now. We've been from the beginning have been working in Western Kenya as a prospective site for building a prototype plant down the road. But the technology is such that we have to first start with laboratory research. I'm an economist. I'm not an engineer, but the engineers have been working at the laboratory level. We're just in the process right now of building a small prototype plant on the Cornell campus to use locally available feedstocks. And then the idea is to scale it up with a operation in the field. But we have been working in the field in Western Kenya for more than half a dozen years now in various projects supported by various donor organizations and others. But forming that link is critical. If you start at the beginning, then you're sensitive to the needs, the ultimate needs, rather than a technology that just makes sense in the lab and has no application.
I put a plug in for CGI. I think making the connections between people, both civil society organizations, businesses, and the scientific community is really one of the reason for creating this marketplace to ensure not only that technology is developed, but that it's distributed. Yossi, I want to come back to something you said, which is that a lot of the discussion, sustainable energy for all, Power Africa, it's been about electricity. It's been about either moving distributed electricity to the village level, or to trying to find ways to really build out the power grid so that more people have access. Near 500 million people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to the power grid. So why the preoccupation with electricity, and how do you move the conversation more to fuels other than? Yeah, obviously you're trying to do that with the foundation and being here this morning.
I think the preoccupation largely comes from our own preoccupation, first of all, with electricity, and the belief that we don't have solutions here for oil replacement, which we now do. But I think a lot of it maybe is people a little bit thinking here what is good there. And I don't pretend to know what is good in every region in Africa. I think one of the things we found out in the study that we did that Cornell did, and with Cambridge and other by the Gates Foundation in 4 countries, is how much we don't know. So in every country, even in the same country, in Tanzania, in 4 different regions, the use of fertilizer, the use of cooking fuel, the use of transportation fuels was in completely different prices, completely different types of fuels, completely different problems. And our assumption that we have we live in a global marketplace is maybe part of that reason, okay? Because we think, oh, it doesn't matter, electricity here, it doesn't matter, it's ubiquitous. Well, it's not. Most electricity in Africa, by the way, is diesel. So those infrastructure exists, and they're used largely to charge the cell phone. So we have to think about things differently, and I think part of it is looking at it more locally, maybe by locals, not necessarily by us sitting somewhere far away and deciding what's good.
Your vision that you described it in your opening remarks really looks towards a kind of distributed manufacturing base for local fuels and liquid fuels in particular, as well as fertilizer. What's the financing challenge of building out an infrastructure that's moving from large-scale industrial production to more distributed and mid-scale, I guess, distribution?
Financing is anyway a challenge. The largest projects, I think, are actually a greater challenge because we all know that very large projects in Africa are kind of bound by a lot of corruption, and a lot of them don't end up being built or used. I think there's an interesting player here that is trying to develop Africa and could be the source of finance and solution because they need Africa. And that there are 2 players. One is China, I'll skip that, but the oil companies. We're finding now a lot of oil around Africa. And we can actually tell those companies, instead of how much money goes back to the state and what kind of a governance we should be building, which is way more complicated, actually attach those licenses to get oil out with a mandate to build this infrastructure, to develop other fuels that are local, take the natural gas, convert it to fertilizer locally. Actually, they have an interest, and they have the financing. they actually have the money, and most people, instead of worrying about what we will do in the money we will get there, okay, first build the infrastructure, then we'll let you get the oil out.
The that's an interesting challenge. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on it, but the question is whether the incumbent players have the the structure to make the kinds of investments that are likely to challenge the incumbent distribution models.
I'll comment on that a little bit from a cooking perspective. What we've seen in cooking is that half the challenge is having the right product, that consumers would need. The larger challenge, I would say, is the distribution. How do you get it out there, and how do you ensure that that distribution is cost effective as well? And that's where we see some of the entrenched larger players struggling in this sector, even though it's a huge market. I mentioned 500 million households, and that is a large market by any definition, in any sector. And where we've seen larger players enter the cook stove and fuel space, they've done well on the manufacturing and getting the right sort of technology in place and being able to produce at scale. But where they've failed, and in many cases then pulled out of the market prematurely, is because they don't have the right kinds of partnerships at the local level. So that trusted third party, sometimes NGO, sometimes smaller enterprise, that has the knowledge of that community, that understands the best, most effective routes to market, and quite frankly, those groups that are going to be there. So when there is a problem with your product, as undoubtedly there will be with any product, you need a spare part, you need to have something serviced, those people who sold you the product are in the community and able to service it. And so what we're seeing, and we're working very closely with many of these smaller players, is that they don't have the access to financing. They don't have the back office operations, the business plans, the accounting, et cetera, to readily avail themselves of investment. And so what the Alliance is doing is providing a suite of financial products from capacity building funds to working capital funds to ensure that these smaller enterprises can be part of the game, can work with the larger organizations as well, and can become more investment ready, so that when the investors, and there are many of them who are interested in the market but still consider it somewhat risky, we're in a sense de-risking it and introducing them to the right kinds of players to be working with. So in this market, at the base of the pyramid, whether it's for fuel or for stoves, or I would argue for a variety of other products, non-traditional partnerships are critical to ensure reaching the last mile and, more importantly, servicing the last mile.
If I could just come back to your previous point, John, I think it's useful to remember most poor people are rural, even though we're used to thinking of images of urban poverty. Most poor people around the world are rural. And many of them are simply not served. And this gets back to Yossi's earlier point about infrastructure. Most of them are not served by the types of infrastructure, rural infrastructure, that we take for granted in a country like this. So this is not to say that the notion of distributed energy, distributed fuels, is not to say that we don't invest in infrastructure, but just that the magnitude of the challenge is so vast in an area like sub-Saharan Africa and other rural areas in the developing world that we need to look for alternatives.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. I think there's probably somebody with a mic, but Carl, if there is no mic, we'll shout it out. Oh, here it comes. Carl Pup from...
I want to ask Yossi and John, if you take the Planning Commission of India's economic growth projections and you combine them with the International Energy Agency's projected prices for oil, you get the absurd result that by 2025, India will be spending 29 to 39% of its GDP on importing fossil fuels. So obviously, and you can run similar numbers for much of South Asia, much of Southeast Asia, much of carbon-poor Africa. So clearly, either our economic growth goals are going to have to be given up, or we're going to have to do something about the price of fuels. But there is almost no conversation about that, in spite of the fact that these are not terribly complicated numbers. Why doesn't this get more attention?
I think part of it is our focus on electricity, which we started. And if you look just at this country to compare the numbers, we spent 2 years ago $800 billion on oil-based fuel, and only $35 billion on coal. And yet everybody talks about coal. So in rural Africa, it's not about what people spend. I mean, when they have to buy cooking fuel, they spend 40%. It's what they don't spend because they can't afford it, okay? So we need to stop thinking in this term, and part of it is all the international body. I will tie to the previous question. The World Bank is not going to do any good in Africa by financing a fertilizer plant, a $5 billion fertilizer plant in Ghana. That fertilizer will go to international market. It's going to be the cheapest. It's going to be able to pay more. It will not get within 100 miles of that factory locally. But if we had one in Malawi, instead of paying $770, okay, from the natural gas that they're going to get out of the ground, they're already starting to get it, that will be a different model. So we need for people to start thinking about that, okay, in terms of prices locally, and start distributing the international aid for project in that regard. We should be thinking about oil. That's where most of the money is for those people, indirect or direct. Okay, we talked about distribution. Distribution is the majority of the cost of almost everything. Food, cooking. You're talking about biochar, destroying the forest. So in Kinshasa, I think the forest is now a few hundred miles away because they cut all of it around the city. So that's why it costs so much. The charcoal doesn't cost much. Delivering to the city is what costs money.
I'll just briefly comment on your question, Carl, and make it worse, I guess. I just came back from China, so it's on my mind. But China's projecting an increase in their oil usage, and almost all of that is imported because their production's not going up, of 400,000 barrels a day per year. So compound that. They're producing 19 million cars now in China. They're projected to get to 40 million by 2025. Most of that running on liquid fuel. So I think the development challenge of having affordable transportation fuel is immense. And a different way to look at that is even governments that are trying to really do the right thing and put a primary emphasis on investments in public education and health systems, et cetera, find their public budgets swamped by just the run-up in the cost of diesel. So I think it's a very important vector. It has to be considered. It has to be looked at. In the Chinese case, their solution is, in addition to trying to secure resources, particularly in Africa, is to use coal for using Fischer-Tropsch to make liquid fuel out of coal. So I mean, you compound the climate problem from that perspective as well. So I think you've raised a very important challenge, and it's why this, I think, initiative is so important, to diversify the fuel mix, to get the price under control, to put that money back into development, to make the right kinds of investments that we saw in the MDGs and what we'll see sort of going forward. Other questions, comments? Looking around in the back.
I'd be really interested.
Could you identify yourself?
I'm Amy Lehman. I work on Lake Tanganyika, which happens to be placed in one of the great oil areas of Central Africa in the Albertine Graben. And so I'm actually really interested in hearing a little bit more about how, practically speaking, oil development in East and Central Africa is going to actually convert not only into this sort of vaster infrastructure development, for, fuel access, but also for the basic building blocks of a stable civil society. So I just came back from Kinshasa, where I participated in an oil and gas conference, and there's clearly a lot of oil in DRC. But I just wonder, practically speaking, if one is advocating, don't go for sort of appropriate governance. DRC doesn't even have their oil law out yet. And oil companies take on a tremendous risk in parts of the world that are, fragile, post-conflict, et cetera. Practically speaking, how do you get to a point where you get a win-win situation and you can attract the kinds of companies, right, that also observe the rules of the SEC, for example, et cetera, where also the local populations are going to benefit from this extraction. You know, there are lots of examples all over sub-Saharan Africa of extraction, you know, some good, but a lot really bad. And so I'd really love to hear your thoughts about, all right, what are the practical steps then that one takes if one is going to throw up one's hands, you know, via the governmental route?
I didn't suggest we throw it out. I just suggested this is not the only way to go about it. I think part of the issue is we're trying to replicate our model, and our model here is to build a large refinery with an economies of scale, and therefore when you're trying to do something like that without enough water to cool it and everything like that in, let's say in Malawi or in a DRC you may have water, but I mean you're looking at that and you say, well, that's not going to work economically, okay? Taking the natural gas that comes out together with the oil, there's nothing we can do with it. We can't build a pipe that will get safe to anywhere else, so we'll just flare it. We have to start thinking about other fuels that can be made from those things, and it can be made at a much smaller scale. And that actually better financeable scale versus the billion thing scale. You can do a fertilizer plant at $20 that will be $20 million that will supply all of Malawi. You can have a fuel plant from fossil fuel. There's biofuel issue, but I mean, if you're talking about the oil company, you can build a much smaller plant, 3 or 4, right in the field that will take the natural gas and make it to methanol or ethanol from natural gas, by the way, not just from biofuel, that can go into the current cars. It's just that we're so fixated about, oh, we need to get diesel or gasoline. And I think we have to start to say, wait a second. People have been running cars on other things for a very long time. Let's start thinking a little bit about it at a smaller scale, which is probably more fitting. And actually, the investments are not that big. And I think international organizations that are involved in those negotiations with all companies, if they start thinking in that way, can put it as kind of a criteria for what do you do in order to do things. That I think the part of the international discussion is very important to force that on the oil companies.
David, did you want to jump in?
Just a brief follow-up. Certainly, your point's very well taken. A lot of it comes down to governance, right? And Mo Ibrahim, who's going to be in the plenary session in a few minutes, has given more emphasis to that than many. The importance of governance in Africa, terribly important for everything, agricultural productivity, the food problem, the fuel problem, and so forth. But I think, again, just to reiterate what Yossi was saying, I think the notion here is the point I think we're trying to make in different words is that there's no single answer. As long as any of us are around, there are going to be problems of infrastructure and access throughout sub-Saharan Africa just due to the vastness of the continent and the lack of infrastructure that exists. So we have to look, I think we all agree, we have to look at alternatives. That's not to say some of the developments that you identified are also going to continue in a parallel fashion, and we just have to deal with those, obviously. Thank you.
Radha, you've been, maybe you'd like to comment on this question. You're trying to build a kind of ecosystem and an infrastructure to have businesses support the distribution of better technology, different fuels, with strong public health goals. What's the role of government? You talked about the supply chain question. What's the role of government in creating the environment, if you will, the rule of law, et cetera, that makes that really possible?
Critical, and in some countries sort of more so than others. You know, we are, as I mentioned, taking a market-based approach, but in a relatively new industry, the enabling environment needs to be sort of fostered, if you will, so that a market can develop. And we see a few things that roles that government can play. One is, you know, in order for market to take off, eventually, even if it starts off with grant support, et cetera, you do need to have investment flowing into that sector. And so one of the key levers, I think, and roles that a government can play in enabling environment is just policies that end up being friendly, you know, both for domestic production, distribution, but in the beginning when there might not be the strength of technology and know-how to be able to encourage that technology transfer as well. And we see that in a few of the countries that we're working in. The other role that governments can play, and we're working with ISO on this along with a variety, ISO being the International Standards Organization, as well as the local standards bodies in each of 22, 23 countries, is to ensure the contribution to global standards, and that's for fuel as well as for stoves. so that there's greater transparency and, from a user perspective, they can decide, given the diversity of choices in front of them, what stove and what fuel combination really works for me, given what's locally available, given my cooking practices, and given that my interest may be, not in collecting as much wood or spending as much time doing it, so efficiency might be, more important than something else, for example. So standards are critical for the user. Standards are also very critical for the investor and for others to know, what types of products, what types of enterprises they really do want to support. So the government plays a critical role in, ensuring adherence to those standards, helping contribute to standards that make sense for that country, and then the whole labeling and certification and all of that. Without that, you won't really have a consistent, transparent, sector that works. And we've seen that, whether it's, Energy Star here in the U.S. or any other version of that. You do need that in every sector. And we're working on that, as I mentioned, because that's a critical underpinning kind of foundation. And working with ISO certainly helps, ensure a strong process. But the governments have to play their part. Otherwise, we won't have a strong market.
Maybe take one last question, then I'm going to let the panel have a few closing remarks. Or comment.
My name is Randall Krantz. I'm a policy advisor to the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Bhutan. They have a very interesting challenge in that they have a lot of electricity. They have 95% distribution over their entire country, and they export quite a bit of that to India that accounts for 16% of their GDP. Their solution for rural fuel poverty is to provide electric cook stoves to people to keep them from cutting down forests and to lower their imports of fossil fuels, all of which so far are imported with the exception of a few small biomass and biogas projects. I'm just curious whether you guys have seen other examples of electricity as a substitute, because you're clearly distinguishing that the problem is usually very separate, but this seems to be one case where there's a lot of overlap. I was just curious to your thoughts on that.
I think maybe one of the issues is that we don't know what's happening. I mean, we're speaking here on the stage, and we really don't know what's happening in every country. We barely know what's happening in the United States. Okay, if the national discussion is on the $35 billion and not on the $800 billion, then you could imagine that we actually, whatever we discuss about whatever country that you'll mention, we actually don't have the data because we don't even survey it. We're looking at it in energy. There's no such a thing as energy. Okay, food is energy. We had breakfast this morning. This is energy. Okay, energy is not the discussion. The discussion is what people are using, what they're paying, what they can't use, how their economics work, where they get it from, what are the sources, what are alternatives, what they're doing when they don't have it. Those are the style, and for each country. Okay, and the region is very different. And I think part of the issues worldwide is to start mapping out those questions, because that will come at a different solution. If you have extra electricity, can you use it? Can you use it for transportation? You may be able to export electricity, but as a bill, as a country bill, I can assure you their oil bill is larger.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating session. I want to get you into the plenary, but I want to give our panelists just a minute or two to kind of give any final thoughts and also any final pitches for partnership that you might want to have with the people in the room. That's really what this is all about. So, Radha?
Thank you. As we've talked about, and you've heard me talk a little bit about cook stoves here, access to clean fuels, clean and efficient cook stoves are really important. 500 million households, their health, the environment is really at stake. And people can't be cooking the way their ancestors did 100 years ago. We're moving forward. We're talking about self-driven cars, all kinds of things in the future, not too distant future. We can't be cooking the way we have before. The solutions are there, and the approaches are really clear. And the more inclusive these approaches are of the communities that we're trying to engage with and help, the more sustainable the outcomes will be. So I encourage you, we've got, when the Alliance launched, we had 19 partners. We're at 800 different organizations that are partners of ours now. The doors are still open for others to join in this effort. So please join us. I've got some colleagues here as well. We'd be happy to talk to you more about what we're trying to do. Thank you.
David?
Thank you. Just briefly, I just leave it with a final thought that poverty is very closely related to energy use. It's almost a perfect linear relationship. It's really remarkable. So when you think ahead, and this goes back to a point John was making earlier, if you think ahead 20, 30, 40 years, think about the GHGs, the greenhouse gas emissions that would emanate from China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and others using energy and fuels at the way we do here, it's really quite overwhelming. So the answer has to be alternatives, and they have to be, in large measure, renewable alternatives that we're simultaneously going to address not only the poverty problem, but the climate problem. I guess I would leave you with that thought of alternatives. We're working on one. We're actively seeking partners in our pyrolysis-based system. In fact, there's some information in the packet that you'll be getting when you're leaving. Thank you.
Yossi, final word.
First, I want to thank you for coming this morning. We're looking to engage. Okay, we're putting this subject for a discussion, really, to start opening the international discussion, the organizational discussion. This is a really new form of way of looking, okay, at the problem. So we're looking to engage. May I ask the Fuel Freedom people to get up? Those are, so you can see who they are, okay. And we're really looking to see you, okay, during this conference. And please approach us. We'd like to talk. We'd like to hear. We'd like to engage. I think we need to start developing the discussion. I think developing the discussion and the inputs and cooperation is what it's all about. This is what this conference is about. And the more we expand that understanding, I think the more we're getting closer to getting the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking the panelists, and thank you to the audience who participated. Let's try to catch up and on the way out the door, make some partnerships, and then we'll get to the plenary. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this session has now concluded. The next plenary will begin at 9 o'clock. Please proceed to the Metropolitan Ballroom. Thank you.
Mohammed, yokku jil ci baay ñas diineem jërëfe